So now as we're going to cover all 21 species, the way that I wanted to do that was I tried to be in somewhat of a what made sense categories, right? So I've categorized them. So at first, we're going to talk about upland white oaks. And so we have 6 different white oaks that occur in the uplands, 3 of which are pretty common, and then the others are less common. You'll notice that bur oak here is in yellow because I'm going to cover it actually in a second category next. So for this first category, I'm covering those first 5 upland white oaks. So the first is our state tree, white oak, Quercus alba. So if you see stuff that's underlined in the slides now, they're going to be the big things to kind of that are very useful in ID, right? So white oak is a large, tall tree. Forest grown trees, so trees that are growing in amongst other trees, tend to be tall with clear trunks and narrow crowns. And actually these are one of the most, in terms of timber, one of the most valuable trees we have in Illinois would be a tall, clear trunked white oak, sometimes in the thousands and thousands of dollars. But open grown trees, so trees that are grown, white oaks that are grown kind of outside of, competition from other trees, tend to be shorter with a big spreading canopy. And overall, even though white oaks have a real variable habitat ability to grow in a lot of different varying habitats, they overall they do best in rich, well-drained upland soils, but you can find them in fairly dry sites all the way into fairly wet sites, and it's found across the entire state. So this is a stand-grown, clear, tall white oak here. And this is a kind of open grown spreading, we call it a wolfy white oak here, right? Just to show you kind of some of the variation in that you can find with white oaks. So white oaks, their leaves tend to have 7 to 9 pairs of rounded lobes. And so sometimes they're fairly the sinuses are fairly deep in between them, and sometimes they're very shallow, right? There are a lot of variation in there, but overall these kind of paired rounded lobes along the outsides of the leaves are pretty classic white oak. Buds are small, roundish and reddish in color, and the twigs are moderately slender, reddish and smooth. But really, with the leaves jump out to you when the leaves are on. It really is clear that way, even though there's a couple other species that look like white oak. This time of year, you can find acorns. So the acorns are oblong, fairly large, and fairly shiny on white oaks, and they typically have a shallow cap, right? So the cap just kind of is perched right on top of the acorn, and when they ripen, they often ripen to this kind of rich chocolate brown color. And again, they're kind of moderately large in size. So white oak bark is light gray to silver in color and highly variable in texture, right? So a lot of times it can be somewhat tight, ridge and furrowed, especially on younger trees. And as they get larger, it tends to get more thicker and deeper, and then often can form these broad, loose plates like you see in that middle picture. Now, this usually occurs on bigger white oaks. But I've seen people even mistake them for shagbark hickories because they're so platy like that and so peeling. But overall, with white oak, you're looking for that kind of silvery coloration or light gray coloration that really stands out for it. So here's just some pictures of different white oaks, a little cluster of white oaks there, a clump of them on the left. You can still see all that variation in the bark texture, but that same kind of coloration, which really jumps out. And then on the right is, again, another big white oak, kind of towering up above everything. So again, it's super abundant, found across the entire state. Another somewhat common, at least in the southern half of the state, upland white oak would be post oaks. And so post oak, unlike white oak, is a medium-sized tree. So this one doesn't get nearly as big as white oaks. They tend to have a pretty stout trunk with broad spreading branches and a rounded canopy. So these are typically pretty short trees, and with more rounded canopy, more branching, more kind of bigger, thicker lateral branches in general. They like poor soils, dry, poor upland soils, or flatwood communities. And so they kind of have this bimodal distribution on the landscape where they're either in the dry, poor soil uplands or in these flat landscapes that we call flatwoods, which are usually have kind of a heavy clay layer in there. And so you get a perched water table for part of the year and it's really, really wet. And then when it dries out with that clay, it gets really, really dry. So it's somewhat of a harsh environment. But post oak seems to thrive in both of those kind of harsh environments, the dry, poor uplands or these flatwoods. And again, depending on where you're at, fairly common in those upland sites or those flatwood sites in the southern third to half of the state. You can see just a couple examples. So we get this this one on the right was grown in a park setting, but it's close. It's a kind of a floodplain or a flatwood system. You can see it's a pretty big, well growing one. The one on the left is growing right out of some really dry kind of sandstone, much smaller and more poorly formed, right? So they kind of occur in both of those habitats. So post oak leaves are typically 5-lobed, sometimes 7, but usually 5-lobed. And then the top 3 lobes are usually really squarish. And so the lobes themselves are blocky in shape, and it kind of forms this cross shape, right? And you can really see it in both of those pictures where you have that kind of like a lowercase t or a cross with those big square lobes. Really jumps out at you as post oak. The leaves are pretty thick, thicker than most other oak species on there. And then the twigs themselves are usually fairly hairy, and that's unusual for oaks. A lot of oaks don't have fuzz or hair on their twigs, but this one often can have some. And then with large buds that are rounded, right? So really circular round buds, which is also differs from a lot of the other the oaks out there. But pretty thick, one of the thicker twigs for an oak and one of the thicker leaves for an oak. And it's probably due to the fact that it grows in these kind of harsh environments. It needs to have those thick leaves to help prevent water loss. The acorns, unlike white oak, which white oak has a fairly large acorn, post oak has some of the smallest acorns for the white oak group. They're really small. They're pretty hairy or fuzzy. And then the cap covers usually about half of the nut on it, right? So you can see on there, really, really small, especially for a white oak, and then kind of fuzzy acorns on there, and then that really big cap on there. Post oak bark is somewhat similar to white oak. It's maybe a hair bit darker in color. It's fairly thick, and it's instead of being shaggy or platy, it typically is broken into kind of rectangular sections. So kind of the long ridges and furrows aren't really long. Instead, they're broken up into these little smaller rectangles in there, and sometimes they're really almost perfectly rectangular. Now, post oak often has what's called smooth patch. And so smooth patch is a native fungus that'll get on the bark, and it causes the bark to slough off. And so what you'll see on post oak a lot of times is areas with really, really shallow, thin bark right beside areas with really, really thick bark. And so a lot of oaks will do this, but it seems to be really common in post oak where you get this patchiness look to their bark. And that's from that fungus that gets on them. But just even looking at the leaves on them, just really, really thick leaves, right? And you can see those blocky square lobes on it, and just an overall kind of real heavy, thick leaf and heavy, thick twigs jump out to you as post oak. And a lot of times you can pick post oak out from a distance, even just from that low growing rounded canopy that you'll see on them, right? It's just usually not a tall tree, usually a big spreading tree. Again, common in the southern third or so, maybe a little more of the state in those right-hand, the flatwoods or the dry uplands. Now, another common upland oak, and one of our more common upland oaks out there, was chinkapin oak. And so they call it chinkapin oak because the leaves look like a chinkapin or a chestnut somewhat, which is where it gets its name. But chinkapin can be a large tree. It can be fairly big if it's grown in an area that has good soils. You know, it can be a tall tree with a narrow crown. A lot of times it grows in poor soils, and so it'll be more open grown with a spreading canopy or really poor formed. It really depends on where it grows. But chinkapin is known for strongly preferring calcareous upland soils. And so calcareous soils just means soils that are kind of over limestone, that have a real high pH. So it does the best in areas with higher pH. And in fact, if you see a lot of chinkapin oak, then you can pretty much bet that you're in an area that's over limestone or some other kind of calcareous soils that have a high pH on them. Found throughout the state, but kind of a little bit patchy based upon that kind of soil preference. So here you can see kind of a stand grown larger one on the right, and then a rougher one grown in rougher kind of poor soil environment that's kind of scraggly a little bit and kind of poor formed because it's growing in kind of a more severe or harsh environment, but they kind of occur on both of them. So chinkapin leaves are usually oblong to narrow. They are unlobed with teeth on them. And these teeth can sometimes be almost pointed looking and almost sharp, and then sometimes rounded. There's a lot of variation in size and overall look of chinkapin oaks. Sometimes they can be really broad and get widened, like the picture in the middle, and sometimes they can maintain or be really narrow, like the picture on the right. So there's a lot of variation here. They're coarsely toothed, sometimes pointed teeth, but you're not going to have a bristle at the end of that tooth. On them, the buds are rounded, angular, brown to almost dark brown in color with maybe some slightly hairy margins. Twigs are slender, gray to orange in color and smooth, but really the leaves are what we're talking about here. These kind of unlobed toothed leaves, and you'll see as we go through, there's several of them that fall into that same category that can be sometimes hard to distinguish without other characteristics. So just another look at them here, just kind of a classic chinkapin oak leaf here. Now the acorns on chinkapin oak are really different than a lot of the other oaks. And so chinkapin can sometimes be mistaken for white oak if you can't see the leaves. They look a lot alike and they grow in some of the same habitats, but the acorns are very different. This is chinkapin oak has some of the smallest acorns for a white oak. And they ripen to an incredibly dark color, almost black in color on them. They also happen to be typically the most preferred acorns for wildlife. They tend to be really sweet, low in tannin content, and you'll see animals really going for those chinkapin oak acorns first before they move on to the other acorns. And I've seen this just in the last couple of years, being out in the woods. I remember last year watching deer walk through a huge stand of white oaks that were literally just dropping acorns like crazy. And white oaks are desired. Animals really like them, but they were walking through all of this forest littered with white oak acorns to find the 2 chinkapin oaks that were growing in the middle of it so they could eat chinkapin oak acorns. So really, really highly desired, highly sweet, a great wildlife tree. But if you're looking for identification, small acorns that ripen to a very dark color. You can see here some immature acorns on this chinkapin oak. You can see just loaded down with it there. The bark does look a lot like white oak, right? So you can mistake them, especially in the winter when there's no leaves or no fruit to go by. Overall, it's usually a little bit thinner than white oak in my experience, and then kind of turns flaky a little bit more than white oak. White oak maintains a little bit more of a thickness and a rigidity to their bark, whereas chinkapin oaks tend to be a little thinner, a little flakier to the bark, but it's that same kind of light gray to silver, ridge and furrow to maybe slightly scaly bark on it. But a common tree, in the right habitats, when you're in the right soils, it's a tree that is usually never a dominant part of the canopy, but is a part of the canopy, and you can usually have no trouble finding them when you're in areas with the right soils. Now, a similar tree, I even hesitate to call it a tree, but one that there's a lot of confusion with, and this is the one that I left out of my talk in the spring, is dwarf chinkapin oak. And dwarf chinkapin oak is really a shrub, but it can actually be somewhat of a clonal shrub, rarely getting over 12 feet tall. That is incredibly rare in Illinois. And they actually had a question about it at the last one. And I said, oh, it's not found in Illinois, because all the spots where we thought we had it were reinvestigated and determined to be just straight up chinkapin oak that hadn't happened to be low growing or growing in poor soils. And then Guy Sternberg from Star Hill Arboretum, who is a worldwide known oak expert, gave me some information about a site that was found in Mason County that actually had dwarf chinkapin oak. So this one, again, is more like a shrub, rarely over 12 feet tall. It's often multi-stemmed or spreading or showing somewhat of a clonal growth. And the key to this one is it's where it's found. And it's really only found growing in dry, sandy, or really gravelly soils. So you won't find it in kind of rocky forest or open forest or anything like that. You're gonna key into these kind of dry, sandy environments where you'd find this one. Again, incredibly rare in the state. A lot of people consider it not in the state, but it's neat to see that a population was found. It can be very difficult to tell apart from chinkapin oak, unless you're familiar with it. Overall, the leaves tend to be much smaller. One reference I found said it often has 8 or less lateral veins on the leaves, so tiny leaves, bluntly toothed, and it's often kind of a wavy margin. So the teeth are so shallow that they're often wavy on those, and just overall a smaller plant. The acorns are very small, very similar to chinkapin oak, where they ripen to that dark brown, almost black color. Very much of the similar size, maybe even a hair bit smaller than it. And then the bark is light gray to silver, shallow bark, kind of turning flaky with age as well. One reference that I read on this one, again, I'm very not familiar with this plant, very much. This is not one I'm super familiar with, but said that one of the most guaranteed ways it would be size at maturation. So if you have a tree that's under 5 or 6 feet tall and producing acorns, then it's probably going to be dwarf chinkapin oak. And if it's over 12 or 14 or 15 feet tall, then it's pretty much not going to be dwarf chinkapin oak. But just know that telling those two apart, when you get the right habitat where you could have some kind of stunted chinkapin oaks, can be very difficult. You want to look for those small leaves, look for that kind of clonal growth, and look for acorns at a very small size for this one. All righty, another, and I think the last of these upland oaks that I'm going to talk about is chestnut oak. And so this is another fairly rare tree in Illinois. It's a medium-sized tree, broad, irregular canopy. And this one's also found in dry, but usually rocky and droughty upland soil sites, right? So it's not that common. It's even state listed. It's state threatened. And you'll find it on these sites that are really dry, kind of ridges or dry upland sites is really where it grows, places that are shallow to bedrock, things like that. The leaves, like chinkapin and dwarf chinkapin, are another one of these kind of unlobed and toothed leaves. They're kind of rounded teeth on it. Overall, it typically is wider beyond the middle on that. The big difference between this one and the others, where we talked about chinkapin and dwarf chinkapin, they have kind of small rounded buds. The buds on chestnut oak are large and pointed. Right, so very large, pointed, sharply pointed buds, which really differs quite a bit than the chinkapin oak. And also the acorns are very different. This is outside of bur oak. This is the largest of our acorns out there. very large, oblong. It looks like a white oak acorn on steroids, right? Huge acorns, but really thin caps. The caps are really, really thin and just kind of barely perched right on top of the acorn. It's a heavy acorn. You can really hear it when it falls in the woods. It lands with a thud. And then it kind of turns a lighter brown color, so not that deeper chocolate brown usually. And this is one that's known for germinating, sometimes even while it's still hanging on the tree, which is kind of weird. But really big, heavy acorns with really tiny little thin caps on top of them. The bark is really unlike any other oak bark out there, so it really makes it easy to identify by the bark. Extremely thick bark, really heavy and really, really hard bark, which gives it its name. Some people call it a rock oak or rock chestnut oak. Really, really hard, thick bark, and then the ridges kind of occur in these heavy pyramidal shapes, right? So they're wider at the bottom, and they kind of come up in a regular pyramid shape and narrow as it comes up on the ridges, but it really stands out. It looks to me a lot like what you think of like a cottonwood bark looks like. A big cottonwood has that kind of pyramidal shape to it as well. Very similar to that, but really, really hard bark. It's very, very fire tolerant, probably the most fire tolerant of all of our species, and very drought tolerant as well. This is a site which is kind of interesting. This is a site in Southern Illinois that this is in 2013. I took these pictures. You see some of the fall color for this chestnut oak, but you also see a lot of mortality. And so this was mortality due to the 2012 drought, where this was on such poor soils, such thin sites that I think literally those, if you remember the 2012 drought, we had so many days that were over 100 degrees. I think it literally just baked these soils and ended up killing these trees out of the sand. But you can really still see that thick bark on that. So for chestnut oak, really rare. You're only going to find it in a few counties, but you're really looking for the right habitat, that incredibly thick bark, and then those huge acorns. And so if you look at our upland white oaks, and again, this is not counting bur oak in there just because I'm going to talk about it next. But there's definitely some differences, and I kind of threw this in here more as a reference instead of just to go over, but it just kind of highlights all the different characteristics of all these different trees to kind of help tell them apart. So I'm adding bur oak here into what I consider stout-twigged, thick-barked white oaks, which I know is a dumb category, but bur oak occurs both in the uplands and the bottomlands. Swamp white oak, even though the name swamp white oak, can occur a little bit in the uplands too. And they both tend to be stout-twigged, thick-barked white oaks. And so I kind of lump them together into a category because sometimes they can be hard to tell apart as well. So that's kind of our next category. So bur oak, a large tree, one of the bigger oak trees out there, although it often has a short trunk and really wide spreading branches. This is the classic tree that you expect to see in growing out on the savannas somewhere on the edge of the prairies, right, throughout Illinois. Really common, found throughout the entire state in every county. It typically has a little bit of a divided habitat, kind of like post oak, where post oak grows in those dry uplands and those flatwoods. Bur oak really likes the dry uplands, like in savannas or open woodlands, or it also occurs down right on the stream sides, right in these riparian areas. And if you get in the southern third of the state, that's really the only place you find bur oaks, is right along streams. As you get farther north than that, you can still find them along streams, but you get them in these prairie upland soils as well. So it kind of occurs in both habitats, which is kind of funny, right? So on the left here, we have an open woodland site in northern Illinois, and on the right, we have a bottomland along a creek and a kind of a riparian site in southern Illinois, but bur oak's doing really well at both sites. So bur oak leaves are pretty large, right? So they have large leaves. They're variable in shape, variable in conformation, kind of how they are, and they have irregular lobes, which means they're not regularly lobed like a white oak. One of the characteristics that seems to be common with bur oaks is the upper lobes. So the upper 2 or 3 lobes are often fused together. And so you get the top of the plant that is not really a lobe, but it's kind of just a big chunky top of the plant. And that's followed by a couple of deep sinuses below that. So kind of deep cuts into the leaves, kind of below that fused upper part of the leaf. And you can see that in all three of these pictures of leaves. They all have that kind of fused top with deep sinuses right below it. Again, a lot of variation in bur oak leaves, but they typically are large leaves and kind of follow those characteristics. The buds are bluntly pointed, often covered in somewhat of a gray fuzz. The twigs are pretty stout for bur oak, and often they develop these corky ridges on them. So they look really, really thick because of all these kind of wings on them or ridges that you'll see on the twigs. But the acorns are the largest of all of our oak acorns. They can get really, really big. There is some variation in size with those riparian bur oaks tending to have really, really big acorns, and some of the savanna or prairie ones having a little bit smaller ones. But overall, bur oak acorns, the cap covers most of the acorn, and the edge of the cap has these fringed bristles. So there's scales on the cap that are elongated to make the whole thing look fuzzy or fringed along the edge of the cap, and that's really unusual looking, and it really jumps out to you as an easy characteristic to identify bur oak. Really big acorns with kind of that fringe along the edge of the cap. Like I said, the bark on it is pretty thick. It can be thick, especially on the twigs with corky ridges. As it gets bigger, the bark gets kind of a darker gray color. This is one that's a little darker than most of the other white oaks. Heavy, thick vertical ridges and deep furrows on it, really, really heavy bark, which helps make it, fire tolerant. But an interesting tree because it grows in different habitats, but it is found across the state, right? Bur oak. Swamp white oak is not quite as abundant as bur oak, but it still can be found across the state. It's a large tree, broad, rounded canopy with thick, short trunks, often large, low lateral branches on that. It occurs in either moist uplands or in bottomlands. It can be fairly flood tolerant, and it often holds its leaves in the winter. There's several oaks, swamp white oak being one, shingle oak being another, that tends to hold onto their leaves even more so than the rest of the oaks. So just to look at a young swamp white oak, you can see some leaves hanging on it, and that kind of, we'll look at the leaves here in a second, and the leaves tend to have a white undercolor to them on the underside, bright white, and that even is very visible even with the leaves in the wintertime. They are very variable in shape. They often look a lot like a bur oak, and it can be sometimes hard to tell them apart just by shape alone. But if you flip them upside down and that you get that bright white underside of the leaf, which is where it gets its scientific name bicolor from, because it's two colored, that really points you towards swamp white oak. Twigs are fairly stout, but they'll tend to be flaky and peeling bark, and you can see that in that center picture, more so than the thick, corky bark of a bur oak, right? The acorns are very, very different than bur oak acorns. They look a lot like a white oak acorn, but they are borne on these long stalks called peduncles, right? So it's really our only oak tree in Illinois that's native to Illinois that consistently produces these really long 2 to 3 inch stalks that the acorns are on. And so that's a really good characteristic to be used to identify swamp white oak. Bark on larger trees can be similar to bur oak. It can get kind of thick. It's usually a little lighter in color, but the smaller stems are going to be flaky and peeling and thinner bark, and that really helps you identify it, as well as looking for that bright white underside of the leaves even in the wintertime, right? So if you're looking at bur oak, on the left you have that corky, thick twigs with the big acorns with the fringes. Swamp white oak, you get that flaky, papery twigs, or small branches, and then the stalked acorns. And again, the leaves can look a lot alike, right? So on the right is a swamp white, on the left is a bur oak. Flip them over, look for that white underside as a great way to identify swamp white oak. All righty, so let's cover our last two of our bottomland white oaks. We covered bur oak and swamp white oak in the last section. Even white oak itself can sometimes be in bottomlands, but there are two two white oaks that really thrive and grow in bottomland systems, bottomland forest in Illinois. And that's overcup oak and swamp chestnut oak. So overcup oak is mostly confined to the southern half of the state, southern third of the state, although it's spread out a little bit there. This is a medium-sized tree. It's often kind of has this twisted growth form. And it is probably the most flood tolerant of all of our oak species. It grows often in poorly drained bottomlands. It grows in swamps. It grows in sites that really can stay inundated for long periods of time. So it's really a species that can handle very wet environments. So overcup oak can look a lot like a white oak in its leaf, right? They look very, very similar. The overall kind of in general, you would say that is that there tends to be a pair of kind of deep sinuses, almost like a pinch in the middle of the leaf that kind of are square. And you can see it better on this picture on the right, where you have this kind of real narrowing of the leaf right here in this pinched look, but you can still kind of see it on the picture on the left in the middle. So that is not always there and not always super evident, but is fairly consistent and a characteristic that you can use to separate this from white oak in an area where they might be growing together. And usually they don't grow together, right? This is way wet. White oak's more dry. Twigs are slender. They may have flaking bark on the larger twigs. Acorns are really what gets you, right? So acorns are large acorns, and they call it overcup because the acorns are nearly completely enclosed by that cup or that cap on on each acorn, right? So it's almost entirely enclosed by the cap, which is really unusual looking. It doesn't have any fringes like bur oak or anything like that. So that really makes it easy to identify overcup oak that way. Gray to silver bark looks a lot like white oak bark. Older trees will kind of turn shallow, narrow, broken ridges. Younger bark may be flaky or platy on it. But really for this one, habitat is a great indicator. That pinched look to the leaves, as well as obviously the acorns that are big with the caps growing all the way over them will help get you to overcup oak. Swamp chestnut oak is our last of our white oaks that we're covering. And it is a much bigger tree, medium to even a large size tree. This can be mistaken in that transition zone quite a bit with chinkapin oak because the leaves look quite a bit the same. But this is actually a really valuable timber tree as well. It's often tall, with a straight trunk. It loves bottomlands and riparian areas and tolerates moderate flooding, but can be a big, kind of impressive tree. So a couple looks at it. The one on the left, it happens to be the state champion swamp chestnut oak. And it's open grown and really spreading. And on the one on the right is more of a forest grown tree that's tall and towering. So the leaves are somewhat variable, but they look a lot like a chinkapin oak leaf, right? So they're unlobed with those teeth on it, coarse rounded teeth. Overall, this typically has more teeth on it than chinkapin oak does, but there's a lot of overlap there. One of the ways to tell it apart, if you remember, chinkapin oak has buds that are a little bit smaller and tend to be striated. They have kind of an edge of the margin, so they're kind of two-toned. So swamp chestnut oak has a really, really big bud that's kind of reddish color, and that really jumps out as well. Those big red buds can kind of point you towards swamp chestnut oak. And then the acorns are very different. So swamp chestnut oak acorns are really large. If you remember, chinkapin oak acorns have really tiny acorns. This has a heavy, scaly, deep cap, and those scales tend to be kind of wedge or triangular shaped, and they're really oppressed. They're really tight on there. Overall, pretty large, heavy acorn, and that's very different than chinkapin oak. Bark is light gray in color, moderately tight, but some narrow ridges on there, but that kind of classic white oak kind of group bark. And so that's it. That's all of our white oaks, right? So all 9 of our white oaks, a lot of difference going on between them. You know, you want to look at habitat. You want to look at, the leaves, of course. The acorns are really useful for distinguishing the white oak acorns. And you'll see that not the case necessarily with red oaks, right? A lot of those acorns look a lot alike, but in white oak acorns, the acorns are very useful in identifying them. So habitat, a little bit about bark, acorns, is really can help you when there might be some overlap in the leaves.